Hello, thank you for joining. If you were given the choice between an American brand drug and a Chinese brand one, which would you choose? After a little digging into not only where American drugs come from, but also how little resources we have devoted to overseeing the supply chain of our drugs, your response may not be so certain. Generic drugs make up about 90% of prescriptions in the US. Most of us don't really think twice about taking a generic drug. It's the same compound without the inflated label price, right? Of the generics sold in the US, approximately 90% of the APIs are produced abroad. About 80% of these are produced in China. About 60% of finished drugs are produced at foreign facilities. Name brand drugs are increasingly being produced outside the US as well. It's quite difficult to determine exactly where pharmaceutical companies produce their drugs since they consider this info to be proprietary knowledge. Now, API stands for active pharmaceutical ingredient. It's what makes a drug, well, a drug. If the APIs are tainted or their concentrations are altered, then the medicine you are taking is no longer as effective and can actually be adversely effective. For an analogy, let's consider beer. In beer, the API could be considered ethanol. If that's omitted, you just have oduals, and that's gross. For beer, omitting ethanol would be a health benefit. But when your doctor prescribes a drug, it's critical that the drug is what the label claims. We Americans should be concerned where our medicine is produced due to safety and national security issues. When overseeing medicine produced outside the US, the FDA's budget and manpower are grossly inadequate. Pharmaceutical drug companies like it this way. They state that they produce outside the US in order to deliver high-quality drugs for the American people at an affordable price. Americans already pay far more for medicine than citizens in other countries, so affordability isn't adding up. While production is cheaper in India or China, the fact that these companies can operate with relatively little oversight is what makes it super attractive to move one's American production base to either India or China. If a pharmaceutical company produces a drug within the US, the FDA can inspect their factory with little to no notice. However, if the FDA wants to inspect a manufacturing facility outside the US, they must give the factory 1 to 2 months' notice. Chinese companies can erect 57-story buildings in 19 days. How drastically do you think they can change a factory if given 2 months' notice? These inspections have become little more than a formality. A factory has to be very negligent to be put on the FDA's naughty list. The crazy thing is, factories are still getting in trouble. So just how bad is their production process? Regulators expect companies and manufacturers to police themselves. As Joshua Sharfstein, a health policy researcher at Johns Hopkins University, stated, the FDA's enforcement role is extremely important. If the FDA isn't doing enforcement, nobody's doing enforcement. What could go wrong when industries are expected to police themselves with little to no repercussions? According to a Government Accountability Office report in December 2016, the total number of foreign drug facilities that have never been inspected by FDA inspectors was about 1,000 of the approximately 3,000. In 2017, the GAO report identified 189 of the 572 facilities in India and 243 of the 535 facilities in China may never have been inspected. After coming under greater scrutiny recently, the FDA has stated that it is enhancing its inspection process in foreign countries. Do you feel more at ease? In July of this year, an article was published in Science titled, FDA Enforcement Actions Plummet Under Trump. According to author Charles Pillar, the number of FDA reports labeled Official Action Indicated and warning letters issued by the FDA under the Trump administration dropped by nearly half when compared to an equivalent period during the Obama administration. It wasn't as if his administration set the bar high to begin with. Furthermore, As published in a Bloomberg article, the FDA's inspections of factories in China fell by 23% from 2016 to 2018. You may think, why don't China and India police the factories there? Well, I can't speak for India too much, but from my experience, China has greatly enhanced its inspection process for factories selling within China, and the consequences for facilities that do not operate up to modern standards are quite harsh. However, China's FDA, which is called the National Medical Products Administration, is not required to inspect factories that are for export. This makes sense. China has to ensure their own people are receiving safe medicine. And they assume a wealthy country like the US will devote the necessary resources in order to ensure safe medicine is entering the US. However, the better Chinese manufacturers get, and the stricter Chinese regulations get, the more difficult the question is whether US-bound drugs or drugs manufactured for consumption in China are safer. In the US, prescription drugs account for over 100,000 deaths per year. There are multiple reasons for this: the Sackler family, non-adherence to prescription protocol, overdoses. But how many are attributed to gross negligence by pharmaceutical companies not overseeing their drug supply? One article written in 2013, titled "Institutional Corruption of Pharmaceuticals and the Myth of Safe and Effective Drugs," estimated that 128,000 Americans die each year as a result of taking medications as prescribed, not including overdosing. We obviously need safer and more effective medicine. 10 years ago, hundreds of people died in the US from contaminated heparin, a commonly used anticoagulant, after a supplier in China used a counterfeit compound to mimic heparin. This was done because there was a shortage of pigs due to a disease outbreak. One pig is needed to create a vial of heparin. Today, China is currently experiencing a pig shortage far greater than 2008, and we're just as dependent, if not more dependent, on China for the production of heparin. Furthermore, sartans, which are a group of drugs for blood pressure, are under investigation since many drugs were found to contain a carcinogen. When you have pharmaceutical companies that consistently go to the lowest bidder, these problems arise. Your favorite Amazon seller shouldn't be inspecting factories in China more than the company that sells you your medicine. Now, moving on to national security. I don't believe we're near a point where we will see a military confrontation between the US and China. With that being said, with the number of carriers in the South China Sea and the amount of military flexing going on in the region, the possibility is greater than zero. This poses the question: how can one country get into any military conflict with another country that supplies most of its medicine? That's illogical. As Mike Osterholm, director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota and an expert on biosecurity, puts it, if we were ever in an international incident with China, they would literally have their hands around our necks in terms of critical drugs. They wouldn't even have to fire a shot. If China were to halt all shipments of rare earth metals to US companies, the US economy would be seriously affected. If China were to halt medicines and APIs, patients in the US would begin dying. US hospitals would essentially be unable to perform many procedures in as little as a few weeks. We are in dire need of bringing industries back to the US. As Industry 4.0 takes shape, economies that are mostly service-based will struggle to be competitive. As automation becomes far more prevalent, each country will have to have serious conversations about how to provide income for citizens. Bringing pharmaceutical companies back to the US, especially for generic drugs, would be an ideal case study about how public-private partnerships can be created to provide workable solutions in the era of Industry 4.0. The most modern pharmaceutical factories are almost entirely automated. This is fantastic for improving quality control. However, don't expect thousands of jobs to return if pharmaceutical factories return to the US. Government is already very closely connected to the creation of medicine, so it's a natural starting point for a pilot program. Many medicines were discovered due to grants from the NIH. Universities are in many ways basic research arms for pharmaceutical companies. Once the compounds become more mature, pharmaceutical companies take the risk of getting the drugs through clinicals and then heavily market them. They are rewarded very handsomely. They should be rewarded for this work. Making a ton of profit off of 20, 30, 40-year-old drugs, though? Have these drug companies focus on developing novel drugs, not just evergreening drugs or creating me-too drugs. Companies often will pay generic companies to delay the launch of their drugs just so the company can continue to profit from their monopoly. This is reprehensible. Once a patent lapses, there needs to be a system in place in order to ensure high-quality, affordable drugs are available. Having a public-private partnership may be one avenue. Profits can go back to the public sector in order to help fund new drug development. The VA and Medicare shouldn't be going broke paying for drugs discovered decades ago. In the US, we believe the private sector can always do a better job than the public sector. Maybe it's time to either bring in new private companies or have the public sector take a whack at it. In addition to safety concerns, many drugs are simply not provided. There has been a recent increase in the number of drug shortages. Drugs that can't be prescribed may not have impurities, but they also don't help patients. When there is a shortage of norepinephrine for just 1 year, there is a national projected loss of $3.7 billion, and deaths increased by 3.7 percentage points. One would assume that globalization would lead to more options for pharmaceutical companies to ensure there are no shortages. Single firms often produce the total supply of certain drugs. It's common to have a sole source for raw materials. To make matters worse, drug shortages have grown more persistent in recent years, meaning that the drug is unavailable for a longer period of time. As this graph shows, there has been a sharp increase recently in the number of drugs that are not available for 2+ or 5+ years. In terms of China's involvement in our supply chain, that's not necessarily bad. If Chinese producers had more of a role in the direct sales of medicine, there may actually be an improvement in value and quality since their name is at stake. Our current situation is to educate Chinese scientists and then have them return to China because that's where the factories are. One must question the outlook of San Diego and Boston biotech hubs if we continue to ship more components of our industries abroad. China is no longer just producing cheap medicine and APIs. They're quickly moving up the value supply chain. Industry regulations and advanced manufacturing are attracting entrepreneurs and companies of all sizes. Take CAR T cell therapy, for instance. In many ways, China is already ahead of the US in CAR T technology. The price for treatment in China is also just a fraction of what one pays in the US. One could literally buy a first-class plane ticket, spend a month at a 5-star hotel with full spa treatment each day, receive CAR T cell therapy care, and still return back to the States, spending a fraction of what one would during a stay at the local hospital. Quality of treatment is just as good, if not better. Many Chinese companies would obviously want to have more access to the US market. If politically necessary, allow them to enter under the pretense that they would help rebuilding the US pharmaceutical industrial base. Have incentives for them to build a factory in the US. Pharmaceutical industries need to get back to creating medicine again. The FDA needs to get back to regulating. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this segment. If you did, please subscribe and give it a like. See you next time.